Hello and welcome back to the POK Podcast episode 4. So for today, I think I would like to start off with just a little bit of a check-in as to what's going on with us, kind of where we're at with the podcast and getting everything up and running. And to start, let's just talk a little bit about the feedback that we've gotten so far. Thank you to our friends and watchers that have viewed the podcast already and have given us some constructive feedback. With that, of course, has come in a few comments, especially on social media, of just, oh, I don't like this, but that's okay. For those of you who have contributed to a discussion, we thank you for that. We hope you continue to do that. And today, we're going to be talking about self-care, so a little bit of a check-in seems appropriate. As you can tell, we're just kind of getting the hang of this, finding our groove, figuring out what works, what doesn't work. And so today we're going to be talking about, well, how do we all manage that and the stress that comes with trying to create a podcast and how America perceives self-care. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the history of it because it's not a new concept. It's been around for a while. It's something that even back in ancient Greece people were talking about. And today it's something completely different.
Right.
And so self-care, the term, is something that everyone's probably heard of. You hear about it in tons of articles all over the news. It's a $10 billion industry in America between beauty products and workout regimes and diets and all of that. And it's also been ammunition of a sort for media to kind of critique younger generations as being mentally less fit, less stable, maybe a little bit more weak-minded.
Sensitive.
Yeah, that's definitely something that's attached to the idea of identity politics. Is what something else we'll get into with this particular podcast, since they are definitely related. So let's just kind of jump in, I guess.
Yep.
So the first thing is that, as I mentioned before, self-care was around with ancient Greece, back with ancient Greece.
Right.
And the founder of self-care, if you will, was actually Aristotle. And I didn't actually know this going into this particular topic. When he was facing his execution, he basically looked upon the politicians judging him and said, y'all need to check yourself. You guys need to reevaluate your souls because we're not doing a great job here. And he wholeheartedly believed in order for a civilization to work, that its citizens need to know thyself. They needed to know themselves. They needed to regulate their morals and their ethics. And that sounds all great and dandy. And it was a great idea, but as with most ideas, it didn't end up translating to that throughout history.
Right.
And so what we ended up seeing down the road, particularly around the Renaissance era, is that publications around self-care ended up becoming publications around self-governance and self-preservation.
Right.
And that's a very one-dimensional way of looking at self-care, and we'll see even in American history, that's become a problem. But for those of you who have heard of Machiavelli's The Prince, if you took an AP English, or not English course, but an AP history course in high school, or you looked at European history in college, I'm sure you've heard the title before. But really, what you need to know about it in terms of self-care is that it was a self-help guide for dictators. And it's where we get the phrase, the ends justify the means. And that's important because throughout history, since Aristotle and even up until now, is that the idea of self-care has actually been, instead of being a tool for everybody to use and say, oh, we all have the capacity to take care of ourselves, instead it's been used as more of a justification by dictators and groups of power to say, well, other people can't take care of themselves, and so we have to govern over them.
Right. So if we fast forward to the 19th century, we see that self-care was used as justification for discrimination against minorities and women, because, of course. So the idea is that minorities and women lacked a stable mind, and they were incapable of taking care of themselves. Actually, Samuel Cartwright, a Confederate physician, famously coined the term, let's see if I can get this right, drapetomania?
I think that's right. I don't think I pronounce it right either, but that's okay.
Okay.
But this is back around the time of the Civil War. So 19th century, yes, it was used for, in many ways, discriminating against women and black people specifically.
Right.
But even before that, in the Civil War, right, was this dude Samuel Cartwright, who was this physician that quoted the Bible, basically saying that, because black people are ill-minded, or they don't have the capacity to think for themselves, they need someone to take care of them.
Right. And so the drapetomania is the desire to flee, or to flee servitude, if you will.
They didn't want to be slaves no more.
Yeah.
Apparently that's a mental illness back in the good old days.
You're feeble because you don't want to serve me. Ugh. But luckily in Europe, a few years after the Civil War in America, Samuel Smiles published a series of talks about educating the working class, famously called self-help. So his attitude towards self-care was way more popular than Cartwright's, and it emphasized perseverance against odds and kind of empowering the common man and taking control over their lives. Fun fact, self-help was published the same year as Charles Darwin's The Origins of Species and was a top seller in Europe. The only thing that sold more was the Bible during the time.
And how both Samuel Cartwright and Samuel Smiles had, the same first name, but what an appropriate last name for Samuel
Smiles, right?
I just chuckled a little bit when I was reading about this just because of the name. Immature, I know, but I thought it was funny.
It's not immature.
But what's, I think, really important about this particular point and the shift in how the general population looked at self-care is that it no longer was, okay, I need someone to govern over me, to take care of me because I'm incapable of doing it myself.
Right.
It was, oh, we all have the power to take care of ourselves. And so that was the trend that stuck. And it gave the common folk, or the majority of people, the power to take control over their own lives, and was a very, very popular notion.
Well, something that I wanted to point out was you even see this in plays that were written at the time. So there's a lot of plays from right before the beginning of the 19th century and, right around the turn that addressed this idea of servitude, specifically with women and their longing to no longer serve their husband, but to be independent, to be self-sufficient, that kind of thing. If you enjoy reading plays and you're interested in that, definitely check out A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen. It's pretty much the most famous play that kind of addresses this idea of serving your husband, but also wanting to be your own person.
Yep. I actually haven't seen it.
The play? I've read it a couple times. I don't believe I've ever seen it performed. But I've read it more than once.
It's on the list.
It's on the list.
But jumping back to America in the 20th century now, the concept of self-care was a huge core component of the civil rights movement, both for Black Americans and for women, as you mentioned, right? Was this idea of, well, not only can we just take care of ourselves and we're capable of providing for ourselves, but we want to do something better than just serve others. And it was a big premise that Martin Luther King advocated for. And the idea being, especially at the time was a very white patriarchal society, was that we don't need essentially white people to look after everybody.
Right.
Everyone is capable of taking care of themselves. They don't have a moral justification to rule over or govern others. Entirely because of either their race or their, in this case, gender.
Right.
But another big shift happened after 9/11. So 9/11 was probably, in the history of the idea of self-care, at least in America, it was probably the biggest turning point, arguably, because it shifted just from, okay, I can take care of myself and provide for myself, but what does that mean in a holistic sense? And the reason this kind of came about is, after 9/11, there was a huge demand for mental health services.
Right, obviously.
There was tons, the prevalence of PTSD went up, depression, anxiety. The population was in desperate need of some help.
Well, right. I know that we were both fairly young when 9/11 happened. 2001, I would have been 9.
I was 7. I was a youngin'.
And you would have been 7. But as an adult, seeing as that it was the biggest terrorist attack on American soil, I think there was definitely a false sense of security that existed before it happened. And then afterwards, people felt powerless. They felt scared. Definitely, like you said, PTSD symptoms, depression. And so I think the mental health aspect of self-care really kind of saw a resurgence then.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And around that time is actually when the term mindfulness was really taking fold in psychological literature.
Okay.
So for those of you who don't know what haven't heard the term mindfulness, I'm sure most of you have at least are familiar that of the word. But it's actually a core uh, point of interest in a lot of psychological research today, particularly when looking at symptoms like PTSD or problems like PTSD, anxiety disorders. Mindfulness training is a very popular treatment these days. So if you haven't looked too much into it, I highly recommend it. But the core thing about mindfulness is this self-awareness piece to it. And that's really what's changed in the idea of self-care is it's not just being able to put food on your table anymore.
Right.
It's not just getting enough hours of sleep. It's not just having, a stable job. There's more components to what it means to take care of yourself. And the more that we learn about mental health, the more and more that's becoming relevant.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the ultimate goal, right, is to live a more fulfilled life.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, actually, is that up and to this point, right, it's really just been, I need to live a life. I need to be able to provide and, put food on my table to, feed my family.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's okay, but how do I feel fulfilled in life beyond just, the going through the motions, if
what
you will.
feeds my soul?
Yeah, and around the 2016 election, on social media in particular, the term self-care just skyrocketed.
Mm-hmm.
You can type in self-care on Instagram and get thousands of results back, or on Twitter, and you had all these articles from news outlets they were posting about how to take care of yourself, and that makes a lot of sense as to why now there's definitely some critique of younger generations embracing this whole self-care idea.
Right.
Is that, they don't like the president that was elected, therefore, they need to take care of themselves now to tend to their mental wounds, which, of course, is a bunch of BS, but I think it's really important to note that when we talk about self-care, it's not this new thing that just all of a sudden popped up. It's becoming really popular right now, and it's a really popular phrase that's used quite often.
Right.
But it's been around for a long time, and it's evolved through time. And today, our cat just meowed at the door.
It's so faint in the speaker, too. It's just like, meh. Anyway.
Yeah, so around 2016, the searches on self-care skyrocketed.
Mm-hmm.
The critiques of younger generations skyrocketed. We are the generation that needs, apparently, to constantly be taking care of themselves. And
well, and to that note, right, we see a lot of the traditional news outlets condemning self-care on a generational level, right? Millennials are lazy, they're entitled, they're self-absorbed. Choose your adjective. The news consensus is that millennials are self-absorbed narcissists. Many have interpreted millennials being fragile and too sensitive as compared to previous generations. Still, others have praised millennials for being more in tune with their emotion, seeing this as a sign of intelligence, emotional intelligence. But I do think it's very important to point out here that criticizing the youth for being sensitive or self-absorbed is absolutely nothing new. So in 2013, Time magazine released an issue titled The Me Generation, calling millennials lazy, entitled, narcissist. However, in 1976, New York magazine published an issue called The Me Generation, criticizing the self-absorbed culture of the younger generation at the time. And there are plenty of examples online where you can see where the photography is almost the same with some of these articles from the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then to the 90s, 2000s, and on. So this is nothing new. The older generation has continually throughout time said that the younger generation was not as hardworking, that was lazy, was self-entitled, wanted handouts, etc., etc., etc.
So why do you think just kind of off the bat, these older generations throughout history have typically come down on the younger generations and critique them for being less, not as hardworking, or even being more needy. I think.
I think it's an adaptive response in the sense that culture is always changing, technology is always developing. Obviously 20 years ago, we did not have the internet culture that we do now. So as things continually grow and change and morph and transform, the older generation is much less forgiving with new information and new technology. So
I wonder if it's almost like a status quo has been established, and younger generations have always, throughout history, to some extent, challenged the status quo.
Well, youth is adaptive, right?
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that a little bit more with the invention of the internet.
Yes.
How it's blowing up, and more, I think, with this particular generation, and of course past generations, but specifically with this one, with the invention of the internet, there has been this trend of challenging norms.
Well, I think that the internet did an excellent job in empowering youth, right? It allowed us to connect and to share our thoughts and opinions about challenging societal norms and political norms, and really kind of energized us. And as a result, we see things like the Women's March and the Education March and the Science March, because we're able to reach each other and say that I don't agree with this, I want to challenge it.
Right. So where do you think this critique of calling millennials, or just younger generations in general, these narcissists, where did this me thing come from, do you think? I don't really have a straight answer to that. I'm just curious, because it seems that even though egos have been a part of American history for a long time, it seems like it's typically the younger generation that gets called out, at least through the news, at least from what we can tell, for having the largest egos, or the narcissistic problem.
So, off the top of my head, here's how I assume that it works, right? Throughout history, things have gotten incrementally easier, right? You have the invention of the telegraph, the invention of the typewriter, the postal service. Like, we have constantly improved on different governmental and societal structures. And as we improve on that, the younger generation is much more accepting of that change, of that development. And a lot of times they campaign for it or pioneer for it. And the older generations are not as perceptive to that change. So I think that you have that mixed with, obviously, the emotional passion that you often get with youth, right? Where they're really engaged with one thing or another. And the older generation sees that as narcissistic and distracted and lazy, when it's really just the development of the world and our country, and things will continually grow and change, and the youth will always be involved in that change.
I also wonder what role just cultural values play in it, right? And I think we talked about this before, about the individualism that's perpetuated in our society, this idea that we value individual accomplishments, that we value our individual abilities to make money and to buy a nice house, buy a nice car. And I wonder to some extent that if those values, when you kind of mix those with an idea of holistic self-care and taking care of yourself, that it doesn't seem like much of a stretch to say, okay, I can see how that can turn into narcissism, right? If you think self-care is treating yourself. if you look on Instagram or
hashtag self-care, hashtag treat yourself.
Treat yourself.
Treat yourself, girl. You deserve it. Treat yourself.
But I mean, I could totally see why that can be interpreted as narcissism.
Oh, absolutely. And do I think that there is a culture of narcissism that comes with every youth generation? Absolutely, right? Their brains aren't developed as fully as 25 plus, right? And so it's almost impossible not to be a little narcissistic when you're, 20s and younger. because your worldview is so limited to you and your experiences in your life. So, yes, most young people are narcissistic, but it's the way of the world.
So you do think that most young people are more narcissistic?
To a degree, but it's not... I don't think it's as problematic as they make it out to be. Right, so specifically with teenagers, most teenagers are very narcissistic. But that's because their worldview is so limited because of their experiences. They don't have any real responsibilities. You know, things are way more tragic to a teenager than they would be a full-grown adult, right? Getting a bad grade in college or graduate school, you know, it does not have the same impact as, you know, getting a C in middle school maybe. Like, you're so terrified, your parents are going to get mad. Oh, God, what did you do? The world's over. So there's a lot of that kind of thinking that goes into teenagers and young 20s that just, like, as an adult, it's like, whatever, who cares?
I might challenge that a little bit, though, because I would say the older in life you get, to some extent, the more sensitive you are to failure, especially around that college age, right? Because once you're on your own, and especially if you're paying your own way for college,
right?
I mean, getting poor grades, although you don't throw a tantrum, still hits your self-esteem really hard.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. So I don't know if I would say that the degree to which we embrace our egoism changes in our young years between elementary school and college. I think it manifests itself slightly differently, right? We have different things that are important to us, right? At the time of elementary school, you know, your parents' opinion of you is a really strong value to a lot of kids. And so if you do anything that might tarnish your reputation with them, it's probably likely to have a pretty significant impact. However, if you're in college, right, and especially if you're paying your own way for college, and granted most college students have a little bit of financial help, at least, but if you get a C, or, you know, you fail a class and you have to retake it, it's, I think, just as impactful to your self-esteem, but it's not because you disappointed someone else. It's because you personally had made a failure.
Well, let me amend my original statement. I think that the more jaded you become as you go through life, the less seriously you take certain things and the less upset you get about certain things. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, I think it just changes, though. We all have our buttons.
Oh, of course.
You know, we all have things that we are sensitive to. It just depends on what the topic is, right? So if you know, were to, this is a very poor example and maybe a little bit too political, but I think about when, you know, the term snowflakes was all the rage, right? Mm-hmm. And there was this, I think it's fair to call it a conservative movement, but it was really this critique of liberals and particularly younger generations being hypersensitive, mm-hmm. right? However, if you were to critique any of their values, it's the exact same response. It's just a matter of what's important to you. So
we saw that right with Michelle Wolf, right?
Yeah.
People were talking about how disgusted they were with what she said. And it's kind of like this thing where it's like, she has plenty of stand-up. You could have listened to it. You could have known very clearly what she was bringing to the table. You decided to hire her anyway. You don't get to get mad.
Yeah, but I guess the point I was trying to make is I don't think our sensitivity to our ego changes so much as to what makes up our ego does.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Right?
Yeah, I think I'm on board.
So, whereas we might throw tantrums over things that us adults might view as being trivial today, you know, if this is a good example, if someone, say, smacks a door into your car when they get out, I would imagine most people are going to get a little bit more frustrated about that, especially if they paid for their car. If someone damages your vehicle unnecessarily, you're probably going to get a little upset or at least a little frustrated. And to some extent, I know plenty of people that throw an absolute tantrum if someone touched their car inappropriately, or scrape the pain at all. It's just a matter of what you value in that moment. And I bring that up mostly around in relation to self-care, I think, is because our sensitivity and what affects us, this trend now of switching over to a very much mental health and holistic perspective, these sensitivities are really important. And being in tune with what you're feeling and why you're feeling it can be a really useful thing. And I think that's why some of the people that look at self-care and are like, this is a really good thing, and that the millennials are the generation of emotional intelligence, is because in many ways it can be another form of intelligence.
Oh, I completely think that self-care and being aware of yourself is a form of emotional intelligence. Absolutely.
So what do you think about, or maybe even just a more general question is, do you think self-care has like a hard-line definition? Is there one definition of self-care?
Oh, absolutely not.
What does it mean then? I know
if I had to give it a general definition, it would be actions and thoughts that you make a conscious effort to perform in order to benefit your overall physiological and emotional health.
I'd say that's a pretty good definition, actually.
Thanks.
Yeah, because I think one of the annoyances that I have when I read about self-care is it always comes off as being like this kind of condescending or just arbitrary slate of information about, oh, well, you need to sleep well, you need to, eat a better diet, or eat a particular diet. Those are the worst ones. Or take time to relax. Like, well, I don't need to be told these things, right?
It's just all very vague. And I think part of the issue is kind of like what you said, self-care is different for everyone. What makes your body and your mind and your soul feel good and feel prosperous and fulfilled is going to be different for everybody.
So maybe then it's we could say that self-care is very much circumstantial.
Absolutely.
It depends on what you're going through in your life and what it is that you need, both emotionally or psychologically and physically.
Right. And self-care isn't always doing something healthy. There are definitely instances where maybe someone works 12 hours a day for weeks on end and they just need a night to go out and have fun with their friends and drink and enjoy the company of their friends. That's self-care. Now, is drinking good for you? No, obviously not. And there's some biological issues with that, but that's what their soul needed. That's how they needed to care for themselves.
That's interesting. Because I guess I had a very different, not very different, but I had a slightly different perception of, particularly when I see like Instagram posts and someone holding up like a 2-foot wide margarita, like it's and just like hashtag self-care, and I just like eye roll because I'm like that's not what self-care is.
See, I would disagree with that. I mean, obviously it's circumstantial and depending on the person, but so when Dorothy comes to see us and we go out and we drink wine and we have a great time, that's a form of self-care. Oh, yeah. Enjoying your friends, enjoying your environment, enjoying your food, enjoying your drink, just kind of filling that fulfilled feeling. To me, that's a form of self-care.
Oh yeah, no, I hear you. I guess where the misinterpretation comes from is to say that going out and drinking margaritas or going out and drinking with your friends, that action in of itself is self-care. And I think we both agree that no, that's not necessarily self-care.
It's very circumstantial.
Right. But also if you've been super stressed out and you need to go out and socialize, then yeah, maybe that could be a good thing for you.
Right.
I could definitely see that. I guess I was just curious about, because there's plenty of actions that people, and this is a good transition into our discussion on how self-care is marketed, right, is you see advertisements all the time about you need to do this to take care of yourself. You need to drink this drink to take care of yourself. You need this bed to take care of yourself. You need this appliance to take care of yourself. And so I think it's very much distorting this more general definition that we've kind of established here of, what is it you need in the moment.
Yeah, so again, capitalism, if anything can sell, it will sell, and somebody will show up to sell it. And so a lot of advertisers have seen self-care as being very hip and cool, and kind of like we said with taglines like treat yourself and you deserve it and indulge, that kind of thing, and kind of promoting this idea that you deserve the product that they're selling because you work hard and you need to experience luxury or whatever kind of happiness they're selling with their product. And they often pitch them as necessities for self-care, which I also find problematic. Because when you push something as a self-care product, I think you kind of create a bit of a placebo effect. Like, if someone buys into your marketing and buys this product and enjoys it, it just frustrates me because using something like self-care, where it's very individualistic and understanding what you need to sell a product, just kind of rubs me the wrong way. But on the other side of that token, I know plenty of people who love taking baths with bath bombs or face masks or that kind of thing. And those are all very clearly self-care products, but these people really enjoy them. So it's complicated. And
I think part of where this distortion of what self-care is too comes from, I think it's like a mixture of all of it, right?
Right.
It's a mixture of the way it's marketed, and it's a mixture of it still being somewhat attached to self-preservation. This idea of I need to do whatever it takes to take care of myself. Mm-hmm. So if it means buying this cup of coffee that McDonald's is advertising, then that's what I need to do, apparently.
Well, maybe that's what rubs me the wrong way. I have no problem with companies selling bath bombs and face masks and that kind of thing, but maybe it's them keying into that idea of needing to take care of yourself, and this is the product that you need to use to treat yourself.
Think about how self-care has been used as a status symbol in a way. It's been politicized for a good chunk of history, right? So maybe by being able to afford the luxury products, you are in some way demonstrating to everyone else, oh, well, I can take care of myself. I can treat myself.
Yeah. But then I think about, like, millennials, right? That work really, at least the ones we know, work really hard and do all these things, and then they spend a little bit of money once a month to do something nice for themselves. And so kind of the idea of a company forcing that their product is the way to take care of yourself is just a little frustrating to me.
I agree. I get, like I said, I was just kind of curious of where these ideas get mixed up, and how does a healthy definition of self-care get distorted by things like, advertising certain products that you absolutely need to have to take care of yourself because that's a good marketing strategy, right? Since self-care blew up, why not use it as a marketing strategy? Because it's going to sell.
Oh, absolutely.
It's going to sell, and people are going to buy it. But like you said, right, it kind of rubs you the wrong way, even though it seems like it's almost a fair game kind of thing to me.
I mean, it's how capitalism works. Everything is fair game.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, if someone wants to participate in self-care, it should very much be a daily thing. What do I need to accomplish to a day? What do I need to do to take care of myself today? And just being, like you said, mindful and aware and reflective of different things. So, like, for me, I know that there's days where I spend way too much time in front of my computer and my eyes start to hurt. And as much as I want to get more work done, I kind of make that choice like, all right, I need to take a break. I need to do something else where I'm not staring at a screen. I need to rest my eyes. And then I can come back to it later. But that's a practice of self-care.
Yeah. Something I wanted to back up a little bit was with the idea of self-care. I just thought of a factor that might play a role in how we distort it.
Okay.
Is that I think a lot of people feel like self-care means feeling good all the time, doing what you need to feel good all the time. And that's just not a reality. Mm-mm. That's just not how people work, and that's not how they should work.
It's important to feel bad.
Yeah, so like the human mind is very much like this wavy transition of good to bad, right? Obviously, you don't want it to be so good all the time. That's how ego and narcissism comes into play. And you don't want it to be flipping up and down all the time because that's bipolar.
Right.
But it's perfectly normal to have your down days. It's perfectly normal to have days that you're feeling good most of the day.
Right.
But it should almost be concerning if you never come down from that high.
Yeah, something that me and Dylan have talked about before is it's important to feel sad. It's important to feel uncomfortable. It's important to experience a little bit of anxiety. But what we encourage you to do is kind of reflect and say, okay, why am I feeling these negative emotions? And come to terms with that in whatever way you feel is necessary. But acknowledging that negative emotions are just as valid as positive ones. And they're just as important to the human experience as positive ones.
Yeah, and you don't have to be perfect to be okay. I think that's the moral of it, right? Is you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be okay. And managing that is with the goal of just being okay and doing what you need to take care of yourself, I think is a much more manageable task than saying, well, I have to meet societal standards and I have to get this job and I have to get this whatever achievement.
Yeah, I would just say do your best each day. And some days your best is laying on the couch and watching 17 episodes of a TV show. And that's okay.
Yeah. And something I wanted to ask you now is, I think we sort of briefly touched on it, but I think we can dissect it a little bit more, is what barriers are there in today's society that limit people's capacity to take care of themselves beyond just these cultural ideals of individual achievement?
Well, I mean, obviously, people that live below the poverty line are concerned about survival, not concerned about self-care, right? Now, obviously, there's free practices that you can do to maintain self-care, but if you're someone that lives in poverty, your number one goal at all times is survival. And so that really bumps down self-care on the ranking list.
Well, I mean, I think self-care is a part of that. Survival is self-care, right? But it's like you're on the first tier of what it means to be, taking care of yourself.
Hierarchy of needs, right?
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it, right? I think for those of you who don't, she's referring to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The whole
food,
physiological
shelter
needs, food, shelter, right? But yeah, what other barriers do you think there are? I think poverty is a big one, right?
Obviously.
And I think one really important one that we were talking about earlier was the educational system. And we talked about this a little bit in our education spending podcast, but in regards to self-care, I'm thinking about kids that go into college, right, with this very much linear path of I have to get this particular degree, I need to have this particular job, and I need to make this much money. And when life doesn't work out that way, or they find out that, specifically in college, that what their major was that they thought was going to be this wonderful career didn't turn out the way they thought it was, they end up getting stuck, or they have to pick something else. And where I went to school at UNC Charlotte, the average amount of time it took someone to graduate was 5.5 years. And the reason for that was because they changed their mind 3 times. They switched majors, right? So one barrier, I would say, to self-care, especially in young people, is the maybe this plays into poverty a little bit, is part of it's the financial burden that education has. And figuring out what you want to do is also a financial burden, because in the time that you're figuring out, you're not making money and you're spending more of it.
Right. So are you saying that you feel lack of guidance in regards to entering college and then college students, or lack of maybe ability to understand what they want hinders their ability to self-care?
Yeah, so I think our system right now, at least as far as college is concerned, punishes people for not knowing what they want to do right away.
I agree with that.
And if they invest time into something, so for example, in my major, which was psychology, a huge chunk of students dropped out after the first semester because they realized that they would have to take a bunch of research courses, statistics courses, psychometrics. Ew, we don't want to do that. They didn't want to do any of that because it wasn't I think most of them were thinking that it was going to be like counseling, or it was going to be very similar to the hot topic or hot job that everyone wanted was to be a forensic psychologist because they all saw it on NCIS or something, right? And when they realized that's just not how psychology works, they were all very disappointed and switched their majors over. So and many of them ended up getting punished for that, right? Because they still had to complete a 4-year degree, but they wasted time on psychology courses, or they just switched it over to a minor.
So how do you feel that hinders them from performing self-care?
Well, for one, it's a financial burden, right? So it comes back down to this. They will have to spend more money to stay in school to figure out what they want, to get a job that doesn't guarantee that they'll have a sustainable salary. So, as you were mentioning with poverty and the financial burden of just being able to survive, a very similar effect, I think, happens with young college students, especially around graduation time.
Right.
Is that, and most students, believe it or not, don't actually go into jobs that are related to their majors.
I sure did.
The theater major to working at a printing company to social media.
God. Yeah, just madness.
But I guess what I'm saying is that the way our educational system punishes young people for making up their mind and seeking for fulfillment, right? I think that is hindering particularly young people's ability to take care of themselves. And when you think about it that way, it makes a lot of sense that a lot of college kids are depressed. A lot of high school kids are depressed because they're thinking about, okay, I have to get to college. I have to get a 4-year degree, and then I have to get a job. It's a very linear state of mind. And when reality hits and they realize, oh, well, life doesn't work in straight lines, now they're in a tizzy and they don't have the coping mechanisms or a backup plan. And their backup plan is just stay in school or drop out.
Right. It sets people up for failure.
Yeah.
The way our system is structured. But if you are a college student out there, I would like to posit that you can perform acts of self-care while you go through school and while you learn who you are and what you want and what you want to do with your life.
Well, the biggest piece of advice I can give for that is be as well informed as you can about what it is that you want to do.
Absolutely.
One of the most helpful things for me when I was going into psychology as a major, even though it's not necessarily the work I'm doing today, a lot of the skills I got from that major I still use today, but I did a job search when I was a freshman. It was part of a project for a learning community that I had. But I went pretty far beyond that.
Right.
I was trying to figure out, okay, so if I get this degree, what in the world would I be doing with it? And ultimately, I came to the decision that it meant I'd have to go to graduate school to do what I wanted to do. But doing that research gave me a lot more certainty as to what my track was going to be in my educational career.
Right.
The other thing I can say as far as college goes is take general education courses first. Take a bunch of these kind of intro courses to figure out what you want to do. That's the most efficient way of saving your time and money, as opposed to just leaping into major courses right away. But that said, and this is not necessarily meant to be a podcast on how to do college, but it just so happens to be one of those things that I know a little bit about.
Right.
But there's plenty of majors where you can't afford to do that, right? Mm-hmm. Take about nursing, for example. You have to start taking nursing courses right away, and even then, you're likely to graduate in 4 years. Mm-hmm. Right?
Especially with all the, intern hours, right?
Yeah, and engineering, too. Same thing, especially at UNC Charlotte. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I just think that particular aspect for time in young people's lives is a very difficult one today.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
because of the financial burdens. And then we also talked about minimum wage playing a factor.
Yeah.
Right? Is that we're spending all this money on education, and then when we get out into the real world, minimum wage hasn't budged. Wages in general are relatively low. Inflation keeps going up, right? And so there's such a demand to meet these financial needs that self-care just seems like it's going to be put in the back burner, holistically at least.
Right.
I don't need to worry about my depression. I need to worry about getting a steady paying job.
Right. I need to worry about keeping the power on. I can't worry about self-care.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to that, again, I would like to follow up with, there are things that you can do to care for yourself that don't cost anything.
Oh, yeah.
Just your mental focus. There's plenty of people that meditate or practice yoga or practice mindfulness, that go for runs. Whatever works for you in managing your stress and managing your anxiety and helping you be a better version of yourself, I think is important.
Oh, yeah. Completely agree. So just me, or do I keep saying, oh yeah, all the time?
Oh, I say right so much.
As we do this podcast, we are very quickly learning the little
our
quirks.
Isms. That's what they call them in theater. Isms. Vocal tics. Yeah. So what do you, kind of what I wanted to finish up on is what we do. What is personal things that we do for self-care, to kind of just give you guys a little bit of insight about us, but also, some options for what self-care can mean.
Whew. That changes. That changes.
Take care of yourself.
That changes like month to month, I feel like.
I mean, it changes daily.
So for me, to give a little bit of background or context, is I was originally going to graduate school for a counseling program. And after almost a year in the program, I came to the conclusion it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. It wasn't that I had a negative perception of what counseling was, or that I didn't want to do counseling, but I just felt like that as a career path for me wasn't going to be fulfilling.
Right.
And I don't think there was enough support for me to want to finish that particular route. And so I ended up dropping out of the program. And we had talked about doing this podcast for a while. And so with that huge life transition of going from graduate school to trying to start up a podcast, came with it a bunch of new stressors that I had never experienced before. Right. And new forms of anxiety that I never knew would affect me. And so one of the things that I had to do, I'm kind of like an all or nothing kind of person, so I immediately started, figuring out better ways to take care of myself, because I was feeling miserable in this transition. And so diet was a huge thing for me, and cooking. Something that I thought was super helpful to me was when I was feeling down, or had those real helpless feelings of like, I'm not doing enough. Cooking was a huge thing, especially cooking for you. I get the bonus of not only being able to provide for myself, which is a big ego boost, but also being able to put something on the table for you that was real nice, and that was also helpful. Doing things with my hands, so like washing dishes. That there's actually a bit of research to suggest that washing dishes is really good for your brain. It's a relaxing technique.
Right.
Also, changing some of the hobbies or habits that I did for a while. Watching TV was a problem during this period. Like the bright lights from TV would just kind of like trigger me or make me feel a little anxious, and so I had to kind of change things up. And it was just on a day-by-day basis: is what do I need today? How do I kind of break this cycle and get back to feeling quote unquote normal?
Right.
But yeah, I think for me it was cooking and changing my diet up. Those foods I ate, I probably did way too much research on food during this time, but like taking dark chocolate every day to improve my mood, because I knew my mood was kind of whack. I was like, I need to be in a good mood to take care of myself, so let's take a bit of dark chocolate, work out, and then cook 3 meals a day, and I'll be feeling better. So stuff like that. Yeah. What about you? What about so I'm curious of particularly when we make life transitions is really or we're either changing careers or changing houses or wherever whatever it may be. That really seems to be the real struggle points of figuring out new ways that you have to take care of yourself. So I'm most curious about how you took care of yourself and what new self-care practices you had to engage in when you decided, okay, I don't want to work a 9-to-5 job, for a particular company. I want to be in control of my own schedule, and just decided, okay, I'm going to go, work online.
Yeah, so a little background for you guys. We used to live in Charlotte, and while I was halfway through my grad program, I worked a 9-to-5 desk job for a printing company, and I absolutely hated it. It was the most soul-sucking experience I have ever had. It's only desk job I've ever had either. Prior to that, I worked in the service industry. I was a waitress at a couple different places, and that was fine. But I had gone into this desk job thinking, like, oh, now I have an adult big girl job, and it was miserable. And I ended up learning about some different resources for people that worked online as far as working in social media and writing and designing. And I was in my grad program for literature at the time, and I was like, if I can make money online writing, I'm going to figure out how to do it. So I ended up quitting my desk job and really just kind of grinding until I got to a place where I was making enough money to support myself, working for clients online. And inevitably that led to the client that I work for now, the dog toy company, which I absolutely love. Do I write? Kind of.
We talk about writing ideas for novels all the time.
Right. I write the copy for a lot of our social media posts, but there's a whole lot of other things that go into my job other than that. But I absolutely adore my job, and I wouldn't have it any other way. As far as self-care practices go, I just think the act of quitting that job was such an act of self-care. Like, I remember talking to you and talking to Kate. Kate's one of my best friends, and just talking about how miserable I was, and there was nothing creative or fulfilling or rewarding about my job, and I didn't really get along with the people I worked for, and I didn't really feel like I was contributing or making an impact in any way. I didn't feel like they appreciated any of the work that I did, and that was not a future that I wanted. And so I think in quitting that job and then working really hard until I was able to accomplish a kind of a homeostasis was a act of self-care for me. Yeah. I am a creative person, and I am a wishy-washy person, and to have 8 hours of my day 5 times a week managed by someone else was just not a reality that I could live in.
Absolutely. So in many ways, you gave yourself more control.
Yeah.
Whereas in this particular job at the printing company, you were very much under the behest of someone else.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense.
And it just didn't work for me. And I'm not saying that those jobs aren't great for other people. It just was not for me.
Yeah, and you had other passions, and
I want to create, and I wanted to contribute, and I wanted to make an impact, and I wanted to work for a company that I agreed with, and I was able to achieve all of those things. So
you also had a little bit more control over your wages as well.
Mm-hmm.
That was another important thing. Is
I could tell them how much I wanted to make, not vice versa.
And your pay in many ways, and now the esteem that you get from the company is based on your merits.
Yeah.
As opposed to someone else telling you how good of a job you're doing.
Exactly, yeah. Obviously, anytime we see an exponential growth on one of our social media pages, it's very much this sensation of pride because I'm doing my job and I'm doing it well.
Right.
And that is not something I ever experienced with my previous jobs. So,
Well, you have a lot to be proud of.
But what about you guys? What kind of practices that you do to take care of yourselves? What do you think is important? What do you think is not so important? Is there anything that you think we've missed in regards to self-care?
Did you learn anything interesting? Did you think about this in a way that maybe you haven't thought about it before?
Tell us what you'd like to contribute.
Comment below. Let us know what you think. Don't forget to check out our Facebook page.
And if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. We put out new videos every Wednesday around noon Eastern Standard Time is, I think, what we're going to be going with.
Yep.
So definitely turn on that notification button so you can know when our new videos are live. We're also publishing on SoundCloud if you're someone that prefers that. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next Wednesday. Bye.
Bye.